Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the book review conversation with the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. I'm Bonnie Jean Feldkamp, the Communications Director, and leading this conversation tonight is Tony Norman, who is the NSNC President, a columnist and book review editor for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Sorry, I'll say that correctly. And I will turn it over to him so he can introduce our honored guest.
All right. First of all, good to be here. Pamela Paul is the editor of the New York Times Book Review and the major domo of all the New York Times book coverage since 2016. Pamela Paul is the author or editor of 5 books, including 2003's The Starter Marriage and the Future of Matrimony, 2005's Pornified, How Pornography is Transforming Our Lives, Our Relationships, and Our Families, and Parenting, Inc., which has a subtitle as long as any sentence in Ulysses. Pamela Paul's 2019 book, written with Maria Russo, is How to Raise a Reader. And I'm happy to say I own one book Ms. Paul edited and published in 2014, but I haven't finished it yet, called By the Book, Writers on Literature and the Literary Life from the New York Times. I dip in and out of that book, and it should be on every writer's bookshelf. It's on my bookshelf. The book review podcast starring Ms. Paul and a murderer's row of talented book reviewers has been going strong for nearly 2 decades, I believe. It's definitely required listening for bibliophiles and writers. Pamela Paul, welcome to the National Society of Newspaper Columnists webinar on book reviewing and all things literary.
Thank you so much for having me. I have the journalist instinct to just fact check one thing, which is it'll be 15 years of the podcast next.
Oh, okay.
So, but it's been running over the course of 2 decades. So,
yes,
which is, a century in podcast time.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, because most podcasts come and go somewhere between 7 and 15 months, and you guys have been at it for 15 years. So congratulations on that. Were you the original host of the podcast when it debuted?
No, the podcast was started before I got to the Times. I will have been at the book review for 10 years in January, but it was started by Dwight Garner, who is now one of our daily critics, and Sam Tannenhouse, who is then the editor of the book review.
Oh yeah. Many iterations ago. As the author of or editor of 5 books yourself, what has been your experience getting reviewed in the New York Times? And do you find yourself in the awkward position of having to decide whether your own work is worthy of a Times review, or do you leave it to colleagues to make that decision for you?
Oh, no, I'm very strict about that. Actually, I'm the only author who doesn't have to worry about getting a negative review in the New York Times, because I cannot be reviewed in the New York Times. And in fact, my books, as a matter of policy, can never be mentioned in the New York Times other than in my byline. Yeah. So I had a 6th book come out a couple of years ago that was a memoir. It was not reviewed. Since I've been at the Times, 3 books have come out, and I have 2 books coming out next year. So they do not get a review. And I have to say, first of all, I'm fine with that. There is no way that it could possibly be done without a conflict of interest. And I'm sure everyone who's listening knows how important conflicts of interest are to the journalistic enterprise. But also, it is a good experience to have been reviewed in the New York Times and elsewhere. I think it is useful to me as the editor. Sam Tannenhouse was the only other editor of the book review who also had written a book, because you know what it is to get a bad book review. And I actually, how great it is to get a good one, and I've gotten some of those, but I've also gotten negative book reviews in the New York Times book review before I was there. And I think that adds, a kind of sense of humility and also just kind of respect for what goes into writing a book. I mean, writing a book is a huge amount of work. For some people, it's a lifelong ambition. Many authors, might have just 1 book in them. And so you have to take that seriously. And I think that if you've been through, the very long and difficult process of writing a book, you kind of know that firsthand.
Right. So, I mean, there's a sensitivity that has to be there, certainly on the part of the reviewer. You have dozens of colleagues and likely dozens of friends and acquaintances at other publications who write books on the side and probably have an expectation that they'll at least get serious consideration when they approach you for coverage. And how do you deal with the politics of friendly coercion, especially from colleagues and friends? Because you're basically surrounded by writers who have book contracts, and there's certainly, I mean, books get reviewed in the Times. Times writers are reviewed in the Times, but how do you go about negotiating that obviously very tricky terrain?
It's super tricky. It's not just that I have personal friends, but I also have reviewers that I work with, that I've worked with, who then write books. Many of our reviewers are authors in their own right. And as you mentioned, many of my colleagues at the Times are also authors. So I will say one of the sort of very few side benefits to quarantine is that I don't have to worry about getting into the elevator with a Times colleague who's got a very negative review in the book review in our own pages. I mean, we're the one section of the paper where it really is fully authorized for us to be judging the work of our own staff. Now, I will say that no one at the Times can review someone who works at the Times. So our daily critics, who are staff employees, the full-time employees of the New York Times, Jennifer Salai, Parl Sagal, and Dwight Garner, they cannot review the work of a colleague, even a colleague on opinion, where there's obviously a wall between the newsroom and the opinion section of the paper. But also in the book review itself, we don't ever have anyone who is affiliated with the Times reviewing someone from the Times. And similarly, we don't allow Times people to review people from the Post or from the Wall Street Journal. They're our major competitors. Yeah. You know, sometimes it's funny because we have so many rules around conflict of interest that we take so seriously that probably the greater, reading world isn't aware of, but that are really important to us. For example, share an editor or an agent with, if a reviewer shares an editor or agent with an author, they cannot review that person's work. If that person has been blurbed before or has blurbed the author before, you cannot review their work. If you've reviewed their work in the Times before, and you're not a staff critic, like in other words, for a freelancer to review someone twice who's not a columnist or a staff critic, they can't do that. There have been very, very rare exceptions, like, someone like Cynthia Ozick, for example, who is in her 80s now. If she reviewed someone in 1974 for us, then we say, okay, you can now review that person's work again. It's been 5 decades.
Right.
But, we keep, for example, lists of everyone who has ever reviewed Joyce Carol Oates,
Must be hundreds of people.
Yeah, it's a tough task to keep finding someone new because she's so prolific.
Right.
And in terms of my friends, and my colleagues, my colleagues certainly all know, they know intellectually that, we're not going to interfere with the judgment that someone renders on a book. That's just journalistically irresponsible.
Right.
So I have been in the circumstance where, good friends of mine have gotten negative reviews, colleagues that I work with and respect get negative reviews. And you really do have to kind of employ that sort of healthy compartmentalization where, there is your personal life and your feelings about someone. And then there is your journalistic work, which is to make sure that everyone gets a fair review from someone who, doesn't have something at stake. I have had instances, just in the last couple of years, where not only a colleague of mine at the Times, but a family member of mine at the Times had a book come out, and it's only one of those, but by marriage. He absolutely wanted to know, who's reviewing my book, when is it running? And I just had to, completely, he did not know about it until it was published. So,
wow.
Yeah, so I take it very seriously. And it's for the same reason that I wouldn't ever have my own work reviewed. It's just, My feeling about book reviews generally is that it's fine to disagree with them, and people should disagree with them. I disagree probably with 80 or to 90% of the book reviews that we run. That's healthy. That's normal. We're not all on the same page, but you shouldn't distrust them.
Right.
So I want people to trust what we're doing, even if they don't like it or agree with it.
You wrote a column, a really informative column in 2016, in which you answered the most frequent questions about the New York Times book review. And I'm assuming that most of our members popping in for this webinar right now haven't read it. I'm going to go over some of those, some of that territory again, if you don't mind.
That's
and,
okay.
and I think the number one question ambitious authors and writers probably ask you is, how does one get a book reviewed by the Times? What does it take for someone to become a reviewer for the Times? Is it all about connections, talent, luck, all the above? What is it? What's the criteria?
We don't, spin a top or or have some kind of flipping of coins. It's, those are two big questions. So let me take on how do we select books for review first.
Okay.
It's a long answer, and I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail. So there are two different ways that books get selected for review. There are the daily critics. That's Jen Salai, Carl Sagal, and Dwight Garner mentioned earlier. And in their cases, they are sort of part of the institution. They're full-time employees of the New York Times. And so their role is, you start with the critic. The critic is the one essentially making their own choices. And people want that from our critics because they come to grow and appreciate what Carl Sagal considers to be important or what books Dwight really likes. People get a sense of their taste because they're always in the paper, every week. But they're also functioning as the institutional voice of the Times. So they do have to keep an eye on what books should the New York Times, not a freelancer, the Times itself weigh in on, and what books are most newsworthy. And that isn't always a matter of taste. In fact, sometimes it's not at all, someone's like burning desire to read a particular book, but it might be incredibly newsworthy, and readers want to know what the Times critic thinks. So they're sort of doing that dual role, like that using that dual lens of what do I think is important and what's important to our readers. And that's how they work. So you start with the critic, and the critic chooses the book, and they have an editor, and I work with them as well. And so there are instances where we might sort of get involved and say, what, this book's really important. One of you should weigh in. Who would like to take that on? And the book review starts with the book, and then we figure out who's going to review it. So it's a little bit an opposite trajectory. And it also, the person making that decision is an editor and not a critic. So we have a staff of editors at the Times Book Review, and each of them has a number of areas of interest and expertise. So we have one person, for example, who never assigns fiction. He essentially does all of the foreign policy, all of the major political books, major economics and economic theory books, all the military history. And that's kind of his role. And then you have other editors who almost only review fiction. And then they have different areas of interest within it. I mean, we had someone actually, an editor who just retired last year after 31 years, but I used to describe her sort of bailiwick thusly, just to give you a sense of how many areas one person can cover. So this editor covered gardening, travel, Japanese and Chinese literature, Australian and New Zealand literature, kings and queens of England and France, but never any other European history. She did crime, she did cookbooks, she did interior design, she did, trying to think, there were other things. And then you have other editors, for example, who specialize more in literature and translation and in experimental fiction. So what happens is, and again, I told you this was a long answer.
No, fine.
The books come in, and I'm talking now pre-quarantine, which we will return to at some point post-quarantine. Obviously, our methods have had to change a little bit in that we do not have physical books right now, and we are not gathered in an office. But in the before times, the way it would work is the books would all come in, and they come in droves and droves and droves. And we open up the mail, and someone on the desk makes a very, very first cut, which really, it's primarily self-published books that sort of immediately get discarded because we simply don't have the resources to cover self-published books. I mean, it's a little bit, for a long time, it was a matter of policy that we did not want to review books that weren't readily accessible, that they weren't carried in bookstores. And that is to a certain extent true, although less true when you have such a robust online marketplace. But it's also simply that as it stands now, we review about 1% of the books that come out from publishers in a given year. And that's already a huge amount of work and triage for our editors. So we just can't take that on. So that person, that very first cut, will go through, he will discard those things, he'll discard textbooks, just a few things that just we do not do. In the past, I used to say they don't do Westerns, which is true. We don't really do Westerns like in the, mass market, but no one's publishing those anymore. Or if they are, they're not sending us to us anymore. The market has kind of changed. But so there are a few categories we don't do, and that person makes the cut. And then you have two other editors who then make a second cut where they go through and they determine which one should be seen by someone who actually really has to look at the book. And that's when they determine which books go to which of our staff editors, who we call preview editors. So they divvy those up, and the preview editors get like actual mail cartons, these big crates full of books every few weeks, and they go through them. And I think, pretty quickly, the preview editors tend to divvy things up into sort of three piles. They're the books that you're going to review. They're the ones you look at really quickly and you realize, not for us, we're not going to do it. And then there's the vast middle, which is the hardest thing. It's someone getting, say, 6 debut story collections in a given, 2-week period, and figuring out which of these ones really rises to the level, or which one, which 2 or 3. And then they decide, and the criteria there, it's a huge range of reasons why something might merit or not merit a review. I have to say, the idea of anyone kind of influencing, or it's funny, people will think if they send me 10 emails, it's going to have some of that. It's just not. There's nothing you can do, because ultimately it really does come down to the book itself. And while I'm involved in the process of assigning, I'm not making those calls about which ones. I have a really terrific staff of editors, and I trust them completely to make those decisions. Now, when they do decide to do which books they're going to review, they also write up any books that they're going to skip. We call them skips, and they say why they're skipping them. So there are instances when they do skip them, there are 3 sets of eyes after that then look at the skips. And we might decide, what, we could overturn it. We might say, I'd like to have one other person have a look at this. I think maybe this wasn't the right book for this person. On rare occasion, an editor will say, will give a book back to us and say, either I feel too conflicted, I know this person too well, I can't feel like, I'm not the right person, or this just isn't my taste, this isn't my thing, I don't have the expertise, could you give it to so-and-so or someone else? So there are safeguards for books that, don't make that initial cut. And then we will have a meeting where a group of senior editors, and I'm in that meeting, meet with that preview editor, and the preview editor presents to us the books that he or she thinks should be reviewed and explains why. So to get to the criterion of why you might review something, obviously there's quality, and that's objective. And in journalism, of course, generally speaking, we talk a lot about objectivity. And what does that mean? And no review is totally objective. It shouldn't be. It's subjective. You're giving your opinion. You're expressing a point of view. It is like being a columnist, an opinion columnist, or writing an editorial. You are weighing in. However, you should be weighing in in a fair manner and looking at the book itself and not judging the book based on the author and who the author is or isn't, or not judging the book on what you wish the book had been rather than what it is, but really considering the work in and of itself. And that's, again, another reason why conflict of interest is so important. If somebody has some, something pro or con that the author, they shouldn't be reviewing that book. If they were on a panel and that person said something nasty to them, or if they had some kind of huge public dispute, on Twitter or whatever, you don't want to have that person reviewing the work, because again, it gets back to that issue of trust. Why should I trust that person? They clearly had an agenda. So we then have these conversations where we discuss why something should be reviewed. We will talk about who the right reviewer is. The person will generally come in with a list, usually about 3 to 10 people that they think could write the review. And then the other editors in the room will often add to that list. And we will eventually, through conversation, come up with a list of the people that we think are best on it and an order in which to ask them to review. Because of course, there are instances where, the people we go to at the book review don't work for the New York Times generally, or if they do, they got another job there. It's like, if we ask Jia-Lin Yang to review a book, she is a deputy editor on the national desk. She has other things to do. So sometimes they're too busy, or sometimes they have a conflict, or they might have any number of reasons. So the first person on our list doesn't always say yes, although we'd like to think they do. And in fact, sometimes the 10th person on the list will write the review and it's absolutely fantastic. And no one needs to know that they weren't the first choice. I think I've probably answered that thoroughly.
Well, it's such a detailed protocol. And I wonder if this was a protocol that you inherited, or is it one that you developed just in terms of, because of your own sort of experience and your own sensitivities to conflict of interest and all these issues?
Yeah, I think probably every editor of the book review has had slightly different approaches. And this is such a fast changing, journalistic world, technological world we're working in, to say that a process doesn't change with time would be insane. It would be wrong. Nobody should have a job that isn't constantly changing right now in journalism. But the basics of it, to my knowledge, are the same going back quite a ways. There was a period in which all of these assignment conversations took place among all of the editors together in one room. And for a number of reasons, that was discontinued 2 editors, before me. So we don't do it that way.
Okay. Well, you've already mentioned the fact that self-publishing platforms and, houses really aren't considered. But what about small presses? Because I noticed that this year, the National Book Awards has at least 2 books that are on small presses, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by a Pittsburgh author, Disha Philyaw.
Yes.
And is that a book that the Times would have, before, let's say Disha was a finalist, would that have been a book, West Virginia University Press, would that have been a book that might have come, it would have come through the transom, but would have gotten that kind of consideration if it didn't have the ABA, the wind in its sails, as it were?
Yes, absolutely. And that book is, I can't remember if that book is being reviewed. It's interesting. Sometimes there are reasons why reviews are late, and someone might think that the reason is, that was assigned because it was a National Book Award finalist. But there are other reasons why reviews are published late. Anything from, someone not filing to someone getting sick who was supposed to do the review, and, us having to, we rarely reassign, but there are very few instances. But in any case, that is being reviewed. And I wish I knew if it was up yet, but very hard to keep track of when everything is publishing online. Generally, we publish books online on the pub date, if not slightly before or right after. But there are some exceptions. And yes, that would have been a book that would have come to us, because we do get all of the university press books, and we do get all the small publishers. And, it is certainly true that in quarantine, it's been a challenge, because all of the publishers know They've known for years what our methods are, and any new publishers that pop up, they get in touch and we tell them. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, I don't know, small publishers in this country and academic press publishers. And we've been working, very much sort of by the seat of our pants, getting geared up to do everything in quarantine, which is just completely changed our workflow. And so if a publisher hasn't reached out to us, a small publisher, there might be an instance right now in which something might not have gotten seen. But we continue to reach out to small presses when we realize, wait a minute, we haven't seen something from, we've reviewed books from the Dorothy Project, for example, which publishes 1 or 2 books a year. So there are always, from larger small publishers like Grey Wolf to smaller ones like Biblioasis and Semiotics and Melville House, and all of the university press titles, they're all getting looked at.
Okay.
It's all a little bit harder, I will say, in quarantine, but we're doing our best.
Yeah, I've noticed that some of the, when I pick up a Sunday book review, the cover story is usually a major writer, we've all heard of, reviewing a book by another major writer. And I wonder if, have you ever broken free of that particular approach just to see what would happen? Have you ever had a not so famous writer reviewing a book by a famous writer or vice versa? Or is that just too much of a departure, that there's a certain expectation for the cover story of the Sunday book review?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you because I do think that we do have new voices and fresh voices and people who've never reviewed before on the cover. And sometimes they're famous in some other capacity, right. But not as a book reviewer. I think Patty Smith's first review for us was on the cover. It was a Murakami novel. And of course, Patty Smith's pretty famous. She's not nobody, right. But she isn't generally known as a fiction book reviewer. But we do have, I do kind of pride myself on us being really open to having new voices review on the cover. It is rare, I would say, for us to have a debut, or sort of very new critic or author on another debut critic or author that ends up on the cover, because generally speaking, we don't really pair in that way. Sometimes we do, but there's a lot going into sort of what makes that right match. And similarly, there's a lot that goes into like what is going to be on the cover. And I think this is one instance in which different editors have had different approaches. I would say that my immediate predecessor, Sam Tannenhouse, who was hired me and was a mentor to me, and I think a great editor, his approach differed slightly in that he was often much more willing to put, if there do was a terrific piece of writing, even if the book itself was very minor, I think he was slightly more inclined to put it on the cover than I am. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's just a difference. I would say that for me, I'm looking for a magical combination. And the magical combination that you really want is great book by a great author, by a great reviewer, and the review is great. And even better, it's also positive, although I have negative reviews on the cover. And you don't usually get all 5 of those things. And so in a given week, and you also want it to be somewhat timely. And, the other component to it is I am looking at this, especially, the book review used to be an independent publication within the New York Times, but this is since 2017, they've all come under me, the Daily Critics, the News and Features, and the book review, which means that I'm trying to balance our coverage as a whole, realizing that most of our readers are not encountering this in the old print world of like, this is the daily newspaper, and these stories in the business section about books, and here's the Sunday book review, but they're just seeing it all online. So I'm also trying to weigh, what else are we doing on this book or not doing on this book, and when are we doing it? And that helps dictate as well the timing of that cover. So for example, if, in general, our institutional voice, the New York Times critics, they generally go first with their review. And then that means that, well, I can't precede them on the book review. So that sort of determines a little bit the timing there. So that's a kind of practical thing that goes into who's on the cover. But in terms of, the sort of more exciting, creative, journalistic reason for picking it. It's hopefully getting that magic combination. I'm trying to think of what we've had. It's easy if I think of an example. And sometimes, we do something totally different. I mean, just to talk about a few recent issues where we haven't had a straight review on the cover, we have theme issues. So we had a Halloween issue that was called Dark Times.
Right.
And there were
very
some,
good, very helpful, at least to me.
and then there was a time, in the summer when, in the wake of the George Floyd killing, where we just said, you know what, we're not going to have a review on the cover, and we instead commissioned an original poem from Claudia Rankin to put a poem on the cover, and we've never done that before. So sometimes we do something completely different, and then there are other instances where we might have a few reviews that really feel like they go together. And it might not be that each book necessarily in and of themselves is like a cover review, but we think, together, this makes a really strong package. Let's say if we have 3 books that are reconsiderations of major presidents, and as a whole, that's kind of a more interesting cover than just one of them, on its own.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, here we are. We're an organization of columnists, and so folks checking us out tonight are like going, how do I get to Pamela Paul? How do I pitch Pamela Paul? Prove to her I'm a really good book reviewer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that realistic? I mean, can they get to you, or do they have to go to a deputy, or do they have to go through a screen? How does one pitch to Pamela Paul?
Okay, it's really easy. It's books@nytimes.com. I don't have a troop of 10 people reading that email inbox. I read that email inbox. I think it's really important to stay in touch with readers and with listeners of the podcast. So I read that myself. Doesn't mean I answer every single one. Sometimes they're better off sent to someone else. But anytime someone emails me there and says, I want to raise my hand as a reviewer, if they don't provide the following information in the email, I will ask them for it. And then what I do is I forward it on to all of the assigning editors, because as I said, very few books are, assignments are generated by me. I think the only book that, there have been a few books this year that I've assigned. Probably the most exciting one was published today online. I did assign Barack Obama's book. I couldn't resist. So that was assigned to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And
it's fantastic. And longer than normal, longer than average, isn't it?
It is long. It is long. And I told her to please go as long as she likes. Look, it's a 752-page book.
Sure.
And Chimamanda does not review. Some people don't like to review or don't review as a matter of policy, and that Chimamanda is one of those people, but this was one of those exceptions. But in general, I'm not doing the assigning. So what will happen is if someone emails me, I will forward it on to assigning editors, and I'll say that when I respond to the person. And what I ask them to include is tell me your areas of interest and expertise and send me some clips, give me some links. And then I will then pass that on. And I know that our editors look at those emails and they will tuck them away. All of our editors have lists that they keep of people that they want to keep in mind for the right book. The thing that we don't have at the book review, generally speaking, is that we don't have, and this is on purpose, and also this is me, this is different from previous editors who've had a very different approach to this. My feeling is that you should never know who's going to review X book in the book review. If there's someone who always writes about Israel, I don't want to necessarily get that person to review a book on Israel for me. I want to know, if I get that person, I want that person, if they're secretly obsessed with science fiction, I want them on science fiction. I wanted something unexpected, and I want different voices on different kinds of books. I don't want the same names in there repeatedly. The byline that I really don't like is so-and-so is a regular contributor to the book review. Because our staff,
that's fantastic.
Our staff critics are the ones that write for us all the time for the New York Times. So we, in the book review, you want to have a constant mix and I want to get people on books that, to me, and again, this is really different for different editors, but for me, an interesting match is someone's coming at it from a different angle, especially because we have our staff critics in the book review, and they're now coordinated together. So if I know that Parl is reviewing a certain novel, I know Parl, I don't necessarily know what she's going to think of every book, and she surprises me all the time, but I kind of get where she's coming from. And then I think, okay, Parl has this view of this novel. Let's say it's a novel in German translation. Maybe I'll get a scholar of German literature, which Parl isn't, to review it in the book review. Let's get a different point of view. Or someone whose last novel was set in Berlin. So it's just looking for something else. And I just don't want it always to be the expected.
Well, I think I think the whole process has resulted in really interesting reads every Sunday. I mean, I've never balled up a copy of the book review and thrown it at the wall. I've always found something that I've enjoyed. The publishing industry appears to be undergoing a shift in consciousness when it comes to diversity, and authors of color are being published and reviewed much more frequently these days. And so have you seen that shift reflected in the Times reviewing pool as well?
You mean in terms of, so I could talk about the books we assign, and then in terms of the reviewers themselves.
Yes. Well, I mean, you've always had diversity in terms of the books, but I mean, reviewers themselves.
Yeah. So I do want to say one thing about the books, though, which is it's often, I think there's a misunderstanding. We don't write the books, and we don't publish them, and we don't decide what's going to be published. We do report, and we have reported our desk overall, on the news and feature side on diversity in publishing, all the issues around that. But we're not making the decisions about what gets published. So we're sent the books, and we then, judge them based on the merits. In terms of reviewers, I would say that there has been overall an effort to bring in new voices, and that certainly means a lot more diverse voices. And diversity, really broadly speaking, I mean, certainly racial and ethnic diversity, but also diversity in terms of gender and sexual identity. Another thing that we have in common, you all are columnists and presumably many on the opinion side. One thing we have in common with the opinion side of the Times is that part of our mandate is that we represent the ideological spectrum.
Right.
And so as with the New York Times opinion page, we want to have conservative voices, we want to have liberal voices, we want to have many voices in between. Ultimately, what we want, and this goes for diversity, it goes for ideology, is that we don't want someone ever to feel pigeonholed. We don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I'm being asked for this reason to do this. So on an ideological basis, that means, look, let's say I get a book in by a conservative. I could either get a conservative person who's going to be like, oh, I agree, this is great, because they like the message, even if the book is terrible. Or you could get a liberal person who says, this is a terrible book, I disagree, but neither of those is a fair or interesting or engaged book review. Those are op-eds. And then, in terms of diversity, I think it's more broadly speaking, as you're talking about it, I want any person to review any book. I want in our pages, just as I think that any person should read any book. Right. And I never want someone to think, when I came on, the big question in the air at the time was about gender. And it was, if you assign a woman to review a book by a woman, then you're pigeonholing this as a woman's book, But if you assign but it was a no-win situation, because if you assigned it to a man, you were saying only a man could lend authority to a book by a woman. So, it's kind of like you couldn't win depending on how someone was looking at it. And you could say the same thing for race and and gender, race and ethnicity. You could say, oh, you're taking a book by a Black author and you're only giving it to, you're giving it to a Black reviewer. Right. And in that way, again, you're sort of seeing things in a really narrow way.
It tokenizes the whole process.
Yes. And some of I think our greatest reviews and assignments, and from what we've heard from some of our Black reviewers, is they don't want to just, in general, everyone's different. But what we've heard from reviewers is, I don't want to just get the books about race. I don't just want to get the books by Black authors. I would like to be able to review anything on any subject. And try to do that. I mean, I
Right.
think all of the staff at the book review is trying to do that.
Mhm. Well, personally, I love reading bad reviews if they're entertaining, but they are probably soul sucking to the writer who has sweated for years to produce that work. And the Time obviously publishes negative reviews. I wonder if that generates a debate among the editors before it's published, and what if the critical consensus everywhere else is favorable, but your particular critic is really down on it? What do you do? And just a little anecdote here. I was right in the middle of Utopia Avenue
Oh, no.
by David Mitchell. When I listened to I listened to the book review podcast before I read the review itself, which was much more extensive. And maybe it's because, like that character in Star Wars, like I could be easily hypnotized or something. But after I heard the discussion on the podcast, I suddenly soured on this book that I was halfway through, and it took me weeks to get the energy to pick it up again. So that's just
Yeah.
a little.
No, I know, like, look, I hear you as a reader, believe me. If I know I really, really, really want to read something, I will read the review like with my eyes half closed, if I can, in a way. I hate plot spoilers. We always trying to avoid spoilers for that reason. I feel terrible when we inadvertently spoil something. But you started that question off. Oh, so actually, when our review differs from the consensus out there, I kind of, very rarely does that upset me. Sometimes, frankly, it feels pretty good, because there are a lot of books out there that get lots of buzz and lots of hype, and our editors will sometimes read it and be like, what, I don't think this is all that, or they don't know, but they think, there's discussion, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of buzz, let's get a review. And the review comes in and it might be negative, and it's really persuasive sometimes. And then, other times a negative review comes in and we're like, oh, darn, we love that book. But we're not reviewing it. We're just assigning it. And again, we don't change that opinion. We don't say like, but what about the part with the mom? Didn't you want to, we don't nudge our reviewers in a certain direction, because it's just not, that's not what the Times does. And then the other thing that you brought up, like, it's interesting when you said bad review and then you said negative review. And I want to talk about, I like to compare like these four quadrants. It's a little bit like New York Magazine's, brilliant, despicable, lowbrow, highbrow.
Yeah.
So I think of there's like four quadrants, right? And there's the good positive review, there's the bad positive review, there's the good negative review, and there's the bad negative review. So the quadrant you don't want anything to land in is the bad negative review. Right. Because then it's like, this person didn't like the book, but it's totally unpersuasive. It's not backed up. It's not well written. It's not stylish, and so then you just think like, who do I trust, as a reader? Like, this review is terribly done. And they're saying the book is awful. I have read negative reviews sometimes as a reader, and I think, I don't like that review. I think I'm going to like that book. Like, I don't like you, reviewer, and I think that I'm going to like that book because you didn't like it. So I sometimes, give that as kind of consolation to people who get a negative review. Sometimes, it's kind of persuasive in its lack of persuasion in its way, to send you in the opposite direction. So, but I think negative reviews are really, really important. Obviously, it's important to our journalistic integrity. But I think it's also like, we're not serving authors in the publishing industry. Like, that's not our customer. That's not our client. That's not our journalistic goal. That's not our mission. I like authors and I like the publishing industry. I have a lot of respect for them, but we're for readers. And our readers have precious little time to read. And there's so many books published. So you think to yourself, like, we're there to serve readers. We're there to help readers make a decision about what they want to read. And there's just so many choices, and there's so much on Hulu and FX and Netflix. Like, everything can't be great. Otherwise, nothing is great. So I think negative reviews, serve a function.
Well, you wrote an essay in the Times, I think it was 2016, maybe it's 2015, about the importance of reading writers you hate
Yeah.
because it makes you a better critic, because you're arguing with a writer and disputing the text in a way that sharpens your own acumen. You even used Ayn Rand as an example, and she is my least favorite writer in the world. But I came to that conclusion after reading an Anthem, which is her shortest book. Would I really have to read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead like you did to understand the depths of how bad she is? I mean, couldn't I learn even more from reading an 800-page book by a good writer and use that time more constructively? You're just sort of following up on your statement about time being precious and there's just so much to read.
Well, look, you don't have to read a long book by someone you hate. But, I think probably this audience and you working, as columnists, as opinion writers, like you all know the importance of, of debate and of strong points of view and of differing points of view. And I'm sure all of you know, you can be in a room with a bunch of people you agree with, and like you're not really going to learn anything new, maybe some fun points that you could pick up the next time you argue with someone on the other side. But what you really want is to get yourself in the room with someone who you don't agree with, because that's when you learn something new, I think. I mean, and
it helps when they're a good writer as opposed to a bad writer like Ayn Rand, who you just feel like vomiting on every page.
Well, she loses on both counts. She's a bad writer, and I don't like her ideas. So, but I'm glad that I read her. I'm glad that I read her because Ayn Rand is one of those people that is referenced all the time in the wider public discourse, and I feel like unless you read someone like that. You might think like, I know that name. Lots of people like that writer. Like, oh, so if so-and-so is quoting that person, like that's good, but and again, like for some people, they love Ayn Rand. Obviously, a lot of people love her. But if it's not you don't know that unless you read it. So it's just kind of exposing yourself to broader ideas. And I think, look, everyone in this conversation, I'm sure knows, like, we're all so siloed. Especially now, like, especially since social media, like it's so easy to just kind of constrict yourself into your way of thinking. And, sometimes I'll go on Twitter and I'll be like, everyone's talking about books. It's amazing. And then I'm like, oh no, it's just because I'm following the book people. Everyone else is talking about Beyonce. They're not talking about books. It's just me and my friends. So it's just like easy to fall into thinking like everyone thinks the same thing. We all like the same thing. So I do think I pick up books, by people who I don't share their point of view. It's funny. A lot of people will say like, I want to read book. A lot of people watch TV this way. They watch a news channel that that reflects their point of view, or they read books that they think that they will see themselves in, that they will agree, that will share their point of view. For me, it really has always been the opposite. Like, I don't want to read about like a 40-something white woman living in the tri-state area with a bunch of kids and a full-time job and like, first-class problems. Like that to me is really boring because I'm living that life. Right. I want to read something else. I want to read something, from Nigeria, or someone from, working class France, or someone writing about California from a totally different point of view. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at in that Books You Hate. Like, read outside your
Right. And that certainly comes through, especially on your podcasts too, which every week never fails to just sort of like blow my mind. First of all, the range of books that you and the critics are reading, it just seems so, it made me feel so bad at one point that I made a point of grabbing books I wouldn't normally read and and reading them. Like I'm currently reading Max Jacob, A Life in Art and Letters by Rosanna Warren. And Homeland Elegies is not, a book I would have read if I hadn't heard you folks talking about it in such a way that really piqued my curiosity and validated it. Mad at the World, Life of John Steinbeck. I just decided that I'm gonna read a lot of nonfiction that I wouldn't normally deal with, as well as fiction. It's made a difference. I mean, I'll usually have 3 or 4 books going at once, sometimes as many as 5, and it takes me a while. But I figure, hey, if I ever bump into Pamela Paul at a party, at least I'll have something interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I'm tempted to talk about those books right now, but
well, it's fantastic. Now, how do you, I mean, what I've always wondered is, how do you, even during a pandemic, how do you stay on top of, I mean, because you apparently read the books that your reviewers even review, because you're able to talk about it with them and make points about books that they're reviewing. I mean, are you reading those books too, or you're reading about them?
No, I mean, it's interesting because there's so many different ways to read a book and reasons to read a book, and you read it in a very different way. Like if I'm reviewing something, and I don't review in this role, like to me that feels a little bit conflicted. So I don't, although I used to review. If I'm reading a book for review, I'm reading it in a really different way from if I'm reading it for pleasure, or if I'm interviewing the author on the podcast, or if I'm talking about it with someone else. But it's interesting, as an interviewer, I often find, and I know this is very counterintuitive, it's not that I don't prepare for those interviews, but I don't necessarily read the books a lot of the time, because I think that being curious about the subject, it helps drive my questions. And my listeners, by and large, I'm interviewing authors, when the book is coming out. So my listeners, generally speaking, they haven't read the book. Right. And if I've read the book and I'm asking very specific questions about it, because I want to know, like, why'd you choose this character to do this thing? And that's interesting to me, but it's probably not going to be interesting to my listener. And it might, spoil a plot, or, sometimes it's too inside baseball. So when I took over the podcast from Sam Tannenhouse, he went much further in that direction. He didn't really prepare at all, but he is also someone who has the Encyclopedia Britannica in his head. So he was able to constantly call things up, whereas I forget things very easily. But he said to me, you're the stand-in for the listener. So you don't want to know too much. You want to know, because that's what the listener wants. So
you know a lot of subjects, because it's just amazing. You can talk to someone about the secret life of squids, let's say, or all sorts of interesting things that are not typical, at least not typical of me.
I'm just like a nosy, curious journalist, probably like everyone else here. So I just I want to know everything, I want to know how it's done. And also, before I was the editor, I, was writing and reporting, and I don't get to do that anymore. So the podcast is a way to kind of keep, in a sense, it keeps me reporting, like I'm interviewing people. It's just that I'm interviewing them about their books instead of interviewing them for a story. So it's just fun to ask the questions that hopefully other people want to know the answers to.
Right. Next week, Barack Obama's book comes out, and you guys have already assigned it and reviewed it and published it. We've already talked a little bit about that. As a book editor at a much, much smaller newspaper, even if I had gotten an early copy of it, I would have been sanctioned by the publisher if I run a review early. So this is a very petty question.
Oh yeah, no.
How fair is that? I mean, are you guys ever sanctioned for going early? Because we're always told we have to sign all sorts of documents saying you will not publish a review before Tuesday it comes out. But I can go to Times Wire right now and read your review of not your review, but the New York Times review of Obama's book.
So I can tell you a couple things. One is we don't sign NDAs at the Times as a matter of policy, so that everyone knows that. They'll still ask us. They still know that we don't sign it, but they know that we in good faith will honor an embargo unless one of our major competitors breaks it. And so in this instance, we didn't break that embargo. CNN broke the embargo, and they're a major news competitor of ours. And so when they break the embargo, then it's fair game for us to then publish on a book. But, you know, and similarly, like the New York Times is a large organization. And so if someone else within the Times got a copy of that book, or if Bob Woodward or whatever it is, and I wasn't involved, even if I've made an agreement, like, you know, Maggie isn't beholden to that agreement. Any, you know, right now it's kind of harder to get a hold of things because like they're not out, we're not out in the world, right? But if somebody gets something and it's not me, and it's they didn't have an, you know, they don't have an agreement, then it's fair game. But we didn't break that embargo.
I was amazed to see it. It was, first of all, it was so beautifully written, and it was like, well, obviously she had a copy for a long time because she really thought it through, and it's just a masterpiece of a review. What's your best argument for book pages in American newspapers? You know, because the bean counters are always scanning newsrooms for easy pickings, and I've seen my own book page shrink and so forth. But obviously the Times, I mean, you guys are another universe. But you know, how would you make the pitch to the publishers across the country about the importance of the book page?
Oh my God, I wish I could like personally defend you against any editor-in-chief or any managing editor, executive editor, anywhere out there who tries to cut the book's pages, because of course it's one of the first things to go. The arts and culture are one of the first things to go, and books are often one of the first things to go among those, because people think, well, TV or film, movies, you know, that has a bigger audience. But look at what's leading the conversation. It's books. What led the conversation this year and under the entire 4 years of the Trump presidency? It was books. It was, and it wasn't just nonfiction by people, you know, who had been in the administration and subsequently left, or by critics writing about it, or reporters. It was also fiction. Like, where did we turn? Where did people turn to get perspective and a different point of view? And that, you know, books are, here's another thing that books have in common with opinion, is that books is about ideas. It's about conversation. It's about perspective. It's you know, if journalism is the first draft of history, it's like books are the second, third, fourth, fifth, and, you know, infinite. They are history. And what appears in a newspaper, even if it's online, can essentially be, you know, ephemeral in many ways. But what's in a book, you know, I always remember like Anna Quinlan, when she left the New York Times, when she was a columnist and she left the New York Times, and everyone's like, Anna Quinlan, how could you? And she left to become a novelist. I think she said something, and I'm paraphrasing, like, you know, I'm sorry to say this to a bunch of newspaper columnists, but like nobody's going to remember, you know, oh, Anna Quinlan wrote this or that column. They're going to remember the novels. They're going to remember books the way that I remember, like, books, she was saying, you know, I remember books. That's what sticks with me. And so I just think that of all the kind of, you know, I think all cultural coverage is incredibly important, because it's through the arts that we see ourselves, that we see our world in new ways. But books to me are, you know, there's a different argument for fiction and for nonfiction, but the nonfiction one I've talked about, and for fiction is our way of delivering greater truths and deeper truths. And if journalism is about the pursuit of truth and delivering that truth to our readers, then books, fiction and nonfiction, all the more so.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's beautiful.
This is a 2-minute warning.
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know. We're at the 2-minute warning.
2-minute warning. Okay. Yeah, we want to.
Almost 8:30.
Okay. All right. I guess. There's a question that keeps coming up. What specifically do you look for when considering a freelance book reviewer? I think you actually answered that, but you want to give it another shot? What specifically do you look for when considering a freelance book reviewer?
Yeah, so when I say, like, when you ask you, I'm not really answering for me.
Right.
Those assignments, you know, but my staff, I think we're looking for a lot of different things. Obviously, we want someone who's going to be a good writer. We can edit to get to elevate writing. We do want areas of expertise and passion. You know, there are certain areas where we are sort of constantly looking for new voices, for voices of authority. as I said earlier, I don't want the same old, same old. I don't want the same person on World War II. If you are interested in World War II, and you are not American and you are not white and you're not in the, tenured professor in Ivy League college, but you've just got something different, I would love to hear that. I think that we're looking to get different voices into our pages and to bring that to readers and to have new people. So a lot of it is really about that expertise, that interest, the passion, the quality of the writing. When I was talking earlier about not having regular book reviews in the, regular book reviewers in our pages, there are some people who are just really good all hands critics, like they can do anything. So it is tempting to just go back to that person and go back to that person and go back to that person again. But generally speaking, because I want to always have a surprise and have new voices, I'm looking, and I think we're looking for the perfect match. We're looking, so some people will be like, in the old days, you'd have a person say like, I haven't done anything for a while. Can you give me something? And we're not an employment agent. So, sure, we could find something I'm sure that like you would be good for, but and you asked about friends. It's like, you can't just hand assignments out to people because they need the work or they want the work, or like, what I want is like, who would be the greatest person on this book? Like, let's take each book, even if it's a short review, let's take it seriously to think like, who of all the people out there, the scholars, the poets, the debut novelists, the established voices, the critics for other venues, like, who do we want to get? And like, let's find that interesting match. So we, to get back to the question of like people emailing and wanting to know, like, how do we get in? It could be that like someone might email us and like not get an assignment until 2 or 3 years later, but it's only because like they had some interesting thing. And then we're not publishing the books. So 3 years later, that book comes along. That's suddenly the match for that person. And then that's when they get the assignment. It's not like we keep a rotating roster and we're just like next on the list,
And that's what we all imagine. So it's really nice to hear that that's not the case.
That's what I thought when I was a freelancer. I mean, when I was a freelance book reviewer, I thought like, where's my next assignment? Why doesn't it just roll in?
Well, we can't thank you enough, Pamela Paul, for spending this time and demystifying the whole process of book reviewing and how things get reviewed and who reviews and so forth. And we could go on for hours talking about this, but we want to be respectful of your time. Thank you very much on behalf of the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. Really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us. This is going to be a hit, and thank you. I hope we can call upon you again someday and either continue the conversation or go in a new direction.
I would love that. Thank you so much. Such a great conversation.
So much.
Talk about those books another day.
All right.